Hi, fourth graders. This is our reading lesson for this week called Our Spanish Beginnings, a little history lesson along with our reading today. It's an informational text. We see a lot of information in here, a lot of pictures, a lot of things that can help us. We see a sidebar in here as we talk about our lessons from Tuesday. So if we look at this, just kind of getting you um, a little bit of a background here of what we talked about or what we read about. We read about Ponce de Leon. He um, joined Christopher Columbus on his second expedition in 1493. Remember, in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Well, in 1493, he went back with Ponce de Leon. And Ponce de Leon became the governor of the Dominican Republic and also of Puerto Rico. And then later on, Ponce de Leon decided to search for something called the Fountain of Youth. The Fountain of Youth was a fountain that if you drank from it, you were supposed to be forever young. And he was looking for that and came across the peninsula of Florida, and he claimed that land for Spain because Ponce de Leon was from Spain. And he claimed that land from Spain or for Spain, and he called it La Florida, and he named it after the Feast of Flowers that would occur in Spain. And that's how he named the state or the territory of Florida for Spain. Then we talked about Spain's stronghold, and they sent people to try and settle there 6 different times. And each time it failed. And they gave us different reasons. One was the crops. Their European crops couldn't grow well there. Secondly was the heat and the humidity. They couldn't stand the weather. The, the next one was the wild and kind of dangerous animals that they came across. They didn't want to settle there. It was not a good place to settle. And finally was the tribes that would be kind of mean and attacking and actually trying to defend their own land. So they didn't like that. So they tried to settle there 6 times and failed. Well, then in 1564, France came and settled a place called Fort Caroline. And Fort Caroline was not that far away from where Ponce de Leon had settled to begin with. And Spain was not happy about that, as you've read. And in 1565, Menendez was sent to rule Florida for Spain. And when he got there, he destroyed Fort Caroline so that the French didn't have any rule or any type of fort in that area where the Spanish had their stronghold. And St. Augustine was born. It was considered the northernmost outpost for Spain. It was the center for missions. Just like we talk about missions, the mission of the church would go on at St. Augustine. And in that time, too, St. Augustine relocated 6 different times. It wasn't safe. They were being attacked. They had to move. They had times when they dealt with other threats too that we'll talk about in a little bit here. Well, during his time there, Menendez had built or established 3 different forts for Spain. He went back home, and then his nephew came in 1589 and kind of took over that work that his uncle was doing. There was a place that was built, and this came after they were having the threats from England. They had settled at Jamestown. They came down the coast. They were trying to take over the coast. And in 1607, they kind of, after Jamestown was settled, they started to have these threats. They also had attacks from pirate ships and other ships, like you read about. Well, here are some pictures of the Castillo de San Marcos. The Castillo de San Marcos is castle. Castillo means castle in Spanish, and it's a stone fortress. All these other forts, this was the 10th fort that was being built, and it's the 10th fort because the other 9 were made out of wood and they could easily be destroyed. and they would be destroyed by the enemies. But Spain sent money at this time to build a strong fortress out of a stone called coquina. And coquina is a type of stone that they use that's almost indestructible. It's a very, very strong stone, and it still stands today. But this was not, as you read, this was not a time that it was like, oh, let's just build it and be done with it. It took many, many years. As you can see down here in the corner, it went from 1672 to 1695 to build that fortress. And that was a very important time, because that, like I'm showing you here, are pictures of what you see today if you go down to that Castilla de San Marcos. The other thing that we talked about at the end of that one section is learning of the past. Archaeology is the study of cultures and people that lived in the past. And what we see here is a Spanish influence still in Florida. And they showed us that by their names and their buildings. And they talked about how you can go there and you can uncover the evidence of buttons and beads and things like that. And they said since the 1930s, there's been over 1 million artifacts that have been uncovered that deal with the that Spanish influence and the colonial Spanish quarters. And you can go there. That what you see in that one picture right over here, the one in the bottom corner, that is one of the displays and things that they have at that or at that fort. It's kind of like if you've been to Mackinac City and you've gone to Fort Michilimackinac, and they have these reenactments and you can see all these artifacts there. It's very similar to that, but it's for the Spanish in Florida. And over here on this picture is just a bunch of artifacts. That's what they kind of look like when they dig them up. It tells them things about the past, though. My son did that in Michigan and dug up a bunch of stuff about Fort St. Joe and how the French lived there and the Spanish occupied that fort and the English did, and how the Native Americans lived in there with the French. Very, very telling by digging these things up. And that's the same there. They dug up these things and they could tell more and more about the Spanish influence. So I hope you enjoyed your reading about the Spanish influence and what happened down in Florida. There's also History's Mystery. I think that's a really neat one too. That they talk about how Roanoke, when he returned years later, couldn't find the colony that was started. On Roanoke Island. Excuse me. Sorry about that. They went off from off the coast of North Carolina. They left 100 people behind, and then of course they couldn't find them when they came back. They were wondering what happened to them, and they thought disease, starvation, drought, anything could have killed out that settlement. Archaeologists found those rings and pipes and coins and beads, just like you see on this picture here. They found those off the coast of North Carolina that kind of showed that there was contact with the early Native American tribes. And then in 1607, again, this is kind of a parallel time to what we were talking about with the Spanish. They set out for an expedition along the Maine coast, and they erected a settlement and named it Pompey, and then the Pompey colony didn't survive, just like in the Spanish one, they didn't survive either. Um, they went back home to England, just like the people went back home to Spain. And there was an archaeologist that began excavating that area in 1994. And after digging for 10 years, they uncovered traces of the colony storehouse and a floor with a fireplace and some other fragments. And that kind of helped them to start to understand more about this colony that was there. And that's kind of how it starts. Usually it's just one of those things where people happen upon something and then go from there and continue to learn more about the past. I will, I hope you do well in your test. It is up. Last